Today, it is not hard to find a fish once you're in an aquatic environment. There are big fish. I mean, sharks are common and they're quite large. But then obviously when one considers the more than 25,000 species of fish and all of the individuals which are included when one looks at reefs, there's just an amazing diversity of fish alive today. The number of species of fish by far outnumber the birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians which live on land. They're abundant in both marine and freshwater environments. But there are no fish at all prior to the Paleozoic era. So in the Hadean Eon, there are 0 fish which are known. In the Archaeozoic or Archean Eon, there are 0 fish fossils which are known. During the Proterozoic, which includes the animal fossils by the end, there are 0 fish fossils known. And so fish are only known from the Phanerozoic Eon, the last 540 million years, and not for the first 4 billion years of Earth's history. The first fish appear in the Paleozoic era in the Cambrian period. There are no fish fossils known prior to that. So one point is fish have not always existed. They're common enough that one would find them if they were. It's not that hard to find a fish in freshwater and marine environments. And prior to the Cambrian period, there are 0 fish. Then the question could be, well, what kinds of fish appear? Did fish change slowly over time? And if in the Cambrian there are bass and trout and sharks and marlin and the diverse species of fish alive today, that would certainly give the appearance that they appeared suddenly. That is not the description of the Cambrian fish fossils. So if one asks, all right, in the Cambrian period, when fish first appeared, what were they like? And the answer is there's only a couple which are known from the Cambrian period, and they share some features in common. One, they are all only a couple of inches long. Secondly, they are jawless fish. They have no jaws. They have mouths, but they don't have jaws. They have no pectoral and pelvic fins. Now, while they have fins, dorsal and ventrally, it's the pectoral and pelvic fins which are most interesting as we get into, where arms and legs come from. So no pectoral or pelvic fins and no bone, only cartilage. The overwhelming majority of fish alive today are bigger than this, have pectoral and pelvic fins, have bone, and have jaws. And so the earliest Cambrian fish are unlike virtually all fish alive today. Now, they are similar to the primitive chordates. They're more advanced in that their head is larger, their brain is larger, they have large lateral eyes. Then some of the head structures which they have in the region of the nose, in the region of the ear and the otic capsule suggest that they had a type of cell called neural crest cells, which only vertebrates have. So they are unlike the primitive chordates, more advanced than them, but more primitive than virtually all fish which would come later and which are alive today. And so these early Cambrian fish, they are transitional forms, intermediate in their complexity. One, Hycoichthyes, is known to have traveled in schools, and there are hundreds of specimens of Hycoichthyes. And so if we were to, depict these fish in the great scheme of, vertebrate life, Mylocunmingia has been compared to hagfish. Now, there are fossil hagfish known. Fossil hagfish had eyes, and that's interesting because in modern hagfish, there are only vestigial eyes, which are no longer functional. And so some have proposed that from Mylocunmingia, primitive hagfish would have evolved, which would be the ancestors of modern hagfish, whereas Hycoichthyes seems a bit more advanced. And some have proposed that from hycoichthyes comes then this Devonian lamprey. So lampreys are known in the fossil record from the mid-Paleozoic, and then modern lampreys evolved from that. Now, let me just kind of go back and go to my slides for a second before getting into these videos. Once I made a mistake in a comparative vertebrate anatomy class, but I think it's an interesting illustration. I had these in the back of the room, little plastic mounts of this invertebrate chordate. It's not a fish, it's a chordate, it's a lancelet. And then I had this, which is the larva of a lamprey. So they were two separate piles. And I told my class, go get samples, we'll look at them under the microscope. I wasn't clear enough. And so some students got one or the other, but not both, because some students looked at these and assumed that they were the same. Now, that was significant because, as was covered in the previous video, there are chordates alive today. And in the early Cambrian, there were chordates, which had features of fish. So primitive chordates like Amphioxus have a notochord, which is the support rod of the jawless fish. They have a throat with slits, which they function as gills, like these fish. They have a post-anal tail. They have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, like fish, and unlike other invertebrates. They have the homologue of a liver and a thyroid, like these fish. And so there are today, and there were in the early Cambrian, chordates which had some but not all of the features of the fish. And there are primitive fish alive today and then in the early Cambrian that look more like those primitive chordates than they do like the typical fish alive today. So fish complexity certainly seems to have evolved in stages. Now, these fish from the early Cambrian were all jawless, and there are two types of jawless fish alive today. This is a hagfish, and although it's a fish, it was originally classified as a worm, which is interesting because the lancelets, which are invertebrates, were originally classified as fish. Here is a larval lamprey. That's an ammocetes. That's the name of the larvae, which then mature into the adult lamprey here. Now, these fish are jawless. They have a mouth, but they have jaws. And thus you can see there's no stomach, because without jaws, they're going to eat. So here's the mouth of a lamprey. It doesn't have true teeth. It just has keratin hooks, which allow it to attach to its prey. So there are two jawless fish alive today. They are primitive. So look at the notochord of this lamprey. It doesn't have a vertebral column the way we think of one. It has this notochord. This hagfish has a notochord. So just like lancelets, their support rod is a notochord. The most primitive fish alive today, the hagfish and the lamprey, their support rod is the notochord. And then these early fish, their support rod was the notochord. So the notochord was the first support rod in vertebrates. Now, I apologize. I'm just going to take a little aside, because when it comes to hagfish and lampreys, how do we classify them? Well, I teach anatomy, and so I like using anatomical features to classify groups of living things, but I also teach genetics. So I like using gene sequences to classify living things. Every now and then, they do not perfectly agree. So both of these would refer to the hagfish and lampreys as the most primitive fish. But we could argue as to whether hagfish and lamprey form one group that is now the sister group of all jawed vertebrates. So hagfish and lamprey, these jawless fish, are equally related to jawed fish, or is hagfish more primitive and lampreys a little more advanced? So if we were using anatomical features, we could make this argument. Hagfish have cartilage in the tail. See the cartilage rays in the tail? See the cartilage support rods in the tail. But hagfish do not have vertebrae. They do not have cartilage along their notochord and spinal cord. Whereas if you look at lampreys, they have this. This is the notochord, but look at that. That's a little piece of cartilage, a little piece of cartilage, a little piece of cartilage. See these little pieces of cartilage? That's how vertebrae began. So the notochord was originally the support rod. Vertebrae then began as an extra support for the notochord. Gradually, the vertebrae would become larger and larger, fuse separate pieces, pieces above the notochord, pieces below the notochord, and it would then become bone. And so the idea of what we have as a solid bone of vertebrae would take 300 million years to evolve gradually in stages. And this is how they began, little pieces of cartilage over the notochord. So if you were to teach comparative anatomy, it is easy to make the argument that hagfish are more primitive, lampreys more advanced. So here in the sense of vertebrae, lampreys have a cerebellum in their brain, hagfish don't. Once again, it seems like hagfish are more primitive. Hagfish, their kidneys can't, control the concentration of fluids in their body. Their fluid concentrations are about that of seawater. So in system after system, it's easy to make the arguments that hagfish are more primitive and lampreys a little bit more advanced. The genetic sequences seem to suggest that they are equally, they form one group that is equally related to the jawed vertebrates. So I'm going to, go forward and forgive me, but teaching both anatomy and genetics, I would like to present what the data suggests, but there's a slight difference between the two. Myelocomingia is not that well understood, that there aren't that many specimens compared to, say, Hycoichthys, where there are hundreds. And so I don't like to spend too much time here, but it has been proposed that maybe this is more primitive than Hycoichthys and lampreys, and that, once again, maybe, from this most primitive fish, then hagfish could have arisen. Hycoichthys definitely seems to be a vertebrate with cartilage around the head, evidence of neural crest cells, which only vertebrates have. And once again, there seem to be hundreds of these known. Now, without jaws, they probably would have primarily been filter feeders. Now, lampreys can be parasites, we'll get to that, but probably they would have been sucking in water through their mouths. It leaves slits in their throat, but then they trap, algae, protists, small animals, maybe animal embryos, which were floating in the seawater, which then get caught in mucus, that then gets swept towards the mouth. So prior to the evolution of jaws, then fish probably preyed on very small items. Okay. When I first started teaching this course on prehistoric life, 15 years ago, it was known that conodon elements could be found in fossil rocks, and they were useful. So for stratigraphy, if you were trying to match, this rock layer found in this part of the world with, a rock layer found, somewhere else, one could use conodons to try to match them up. So while these were useful elements in geology, it wasn't known to what animal these conodons belonged. And then it was then rather exciting when it was discovered that conodon elements were found in the mouth of conodons, which is a type of jawless fish. So conodons come later, but they seem to be now one step above, say, the Cambrian jawless fish and lampreys, in that they have large lateral eyes. They had a larger brain. They seem to be more active swimmers. And so once again, as we are looking at the evolution of the fish body plan, there seem to have been stages, and conodons are jawless fish, which are then more advanced than those of the Cambrian or the hagfish or lampreys, which exist today. Jawless fish were the only fish on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. By the end of the Cambrian, jawless fish were producing bone tissue. Now I represent the jawless fish here with just outlines because we don't have complete skeletons, just bony fragments. But bone first evolved in jawless fish. And then by the Ordovician period, jawless fish were quite diverse. So they not only had bone, but many of them had bone in what's called a head shield. So their head was protected by bone and the rest of their skeleton was cartilaginous. Now that's exciting because when we talk about vertebrate embryos, even human vertebrate embryos form bone here. Bone forms in the head of the embryo, but the rest of the skeleton is cartilage, which gradually becomes bone. And if we look at vertebrate fossils, we see that bone first appears in the head, the rest of the skeleton was cartilage, but it then gradually becomes bone. So for tens of millions of years, there are jawless fish and diverse groups of them, but they are more advanced than any jawless fish alive today. Some actually get pectoral fins. No pelvic fins are known in jawless fish, but pectoral fins, which is exciting because in later groups we want to talk about arms. And then some, like these thelodonts, seem to be thicker in the middle and arguably might now have had a stomach, which would be more advanced than the jawless fish alive today. Before there were any modern vertebrates, there were chordates from the early Cambrian, which have things like the notochord, the pharyngeal slits. So there are invertebrates with some but not all of the features of the fish. And the first fish are primitive in having, being these jawless fish, unlike the fish of today. These jawless fish, once again, seem to then gradually increase in complexity. So maybe hagfish represent a primitive lineage. The lampreys would represent perhaps true vertebrates. If hagfish are not vertebrates, because they don't have vertebrae, the term craniates is used because one of the things that fish did, all vertebrates have a much larger brain than the primitive chordates. Conodonts would be more advanced still. And then the other lineages of jawless fish would then have additional advances. Some would have bone tissue, and you can see these, in museums, but they formed these head shields. So this is just the head shield of various fish, and they were quite diverse. So there were different groups of jawless fish in the Paleozoic, and within a group, say the Galeaspids, one could see that there was a great diversity of head shields. Some actually evolved pectoral fins, which are important because we want to talk about arms in the future. And so some jawless fish were more advanced than others in having head shields, which could vary. I mean, you can see the great variation in form here. And then even pectoral fins in some. And some, because they just seem to be a bit thicker in the middle, might have had stomachs. The majority of these were quite small, but I've read that they could certainly be 3 feet long and maybe one a bit longer than that. Before saying a few words on lampreys, I'd like to just talk about chromosomes, because with the early fish, this is relevant. Chromosomes vary. And when one compares chromosomes of, say, one dog, to a fox, or from one mosquito to another, or from humans to non-human apes, etc., one realizes that we often speak of chromosomes in, a chromosomal abnormality, which can cause a problem for an individual, or a miscarriage, etc. But chromosomal changes are apparently very important in speciation. So when one asks among the cats or among the monkeys or among the mosquitoes or the flies, etc., what makes different species? Why is this group separated from this group and they don't have offspring together? Very often it's a chromosomal difference. And so chromosomal change is very important in speciation. But then chromosomal differences can also come up with the idea of complexity. Now, I don't mean to get into a lot of genetics here, but very often what makes higher vertebrates have more complex mechanisms than lower vertebrates is that there are multiple copies of genes, which then allows for more regulation. Instead of having one gene, if you have 2 or 4 or more, you could say turn one on in the brain and one on in the liver, and then over time they can vary, so that as you duplicate existing genes, now these can then vary a little bit and then give you greater flexibility. So from one ancestral globin protein, for example, there were duplications, which leads to myoglobin in muscle, alpha hemoglobin, beta hemoglobin in red blood cells, but then also a number of fetal hemoglobins like gamma and eta or epsilon. Opsins for the eye let us perceive light, but then duplications can let us distinguish between rods and cones seeing in color. Duplications in cones could then give you blue versus red and green. Duplications of the red and green could then give you trichromatic vision like we higher primates have. So this is significant, and the reason it's significant here, if you were to say compare the number of genes present in, say, a fruit fly or many invertebrates to what vertebrates have, very often you find that invertebrates have 1 while vertebrates have 4. And then you compare a different gene. Oh, invertebrates have 1 and we have 4. Invertebrates have 1 of these and we have 4. That just pops up a lot. Invertebrates have 1 Hox cluster. We have 4 of these regulatory Hox genes for embryonic development. Why? Well, something that happens every now and then, there's a genome duplication. A genetic accident occurs, and there ends up then being double the amount of genetic information that was originally present. So here's an example where in Pope's gray tree frog, the number of chromosomes in the nucleus is 24, but in the more common gray tree frog, the number of chromosomes per nucleus is 48. It seems that there was a genetic accident in their ancestors. I mean, they look so similar. You can't distinguish them visually. You can only distinguish them by how their call sounds. That there was an accident, and then an embryo has double the number of chromosomes that typical members have, and that this almost creates an instant species. All right. Now, this can often then be lethal. But it's common enough when you look at fish or amphibians or plants. When you go to the supermarket, a lot of the plants there are polyploid, where they have multiple sets of chromosomes. So while this can be a lethal accident, often enough, it then leads to a new species. So polyploidy, an accident which doubles the number of chromosomes, it does happen. And that seems to have happened twice in the early vertebrates. So when one compares the chordates to the first fish, all right, it seems that there was a genome duplication where jawless fish now have double the 2 sets of the genes found in the invertebrate chordates. But then one looks at the jawed vertebrates, it seems that there was yet another genome duplication, so that the jawed vertebrates have 4 times the number of genes that you could find in, say, invertebrates, and then double the number that you would find, say, in a lamprey. So where a lamprey maybe has 1 gene, such as a number of very specific genes involved in the head formation, the jawed vertebrates have 2. And so maybe that was significant in the evolution of jaws and of jawed vertebrates, these genome duplications. So in any case, if one was asking, how does one become more complex over time? There's lots of little genetic changes that can occur, but apparently there were 2 rounds of genome duplication. One, which was a factor, probably a significant one in the origin of vertebrates in general, the first fish, but then another one with the origin of the jawed vertebrates, so that from primitive jawless fish, a genome duplication helped produce jawed vertebrates. Here is a modern lamprey. So you can see very clearly the pharyngeal arches here. Notice that an early development in the fish was to develop large lateral eyes that are not found in any chordates. Once again, you can see those pharyngeal arches. And today, there are 3 families of lampreys which are known, 2 of which only live in southern continents. One is found in the northern continents. So here are the 2 families known from, say, Australia, South America, while the more than 40 species in the family Petromyzontidae, they are found in northern continents. Lampreys vary. They go through that larval stage that I had shown you, those amocetes. So after they produce eggs, and females can produce, 100, 200,000 eggs at a time. Here's a female lamprey, and you can see all of each dot then is an egg. These hatch then into these amocete larvae, which are filter feeders, feeding on algae, protists, bacteria, and then just dead organic matter. So they can, just debris from leaves and from the mud, organic decaying material they can make use of. They can live years in this state, getting bigger, and then they mature. Now, some mature into non-parasitic forms, just adults, which will then breed, lay eggs, and then die. So the adults are non-feeding, but there are some which are then parasites. They use their mouths to attach to fish and then to suck out blood and other fluids before they then breed. Now, these can be devastating. So the sea lamprey, each lamprey can kill 40 pounds of fish in order to mature to the point where it lays eggs, taking about a year or 18 months in this parasitic form. And just significant because when in the early 1900s, sea lampreys were able to go from Lake Ontario, where they had been found, and using the Welland Canal, which was man-made, reach Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes, they were able to just, become a devastating parasite in the fish which were native to the Great Lakes. So just a comment on the sea lamprey. So jawless fish are the most primitive fish alive today, and they were the first fish in the fossil record for tens of millions of years. Jawless fish were the only fish. But then somewhere between the Ordovician and Silurian periods, another genome duplication occurred. And as I'll mention in the next video, the cartilage in the pharyngeal arch was modified so that the first 2 pharyngeal arches became jaws.